A self-assured professor thought humiliating Elon Musk in front of his students would be easy, until Musk turned the lesson on him in the most unexpected way. The lecture hall at Stanford University was packed. Rows of students sat hunched over their desks, notebooks open, laptops glowing, waiting for Professor Andrew Wallace to begin his usual deep dive into advanced calculus. Wallace was a man who commanded attention, a mathematician through and through. He carried himself with the smug certainty of someone who had never been outmatched in his own domain. He had built a reputation for being sharp, cutting even, not just with his intellect but with his words. He didn't just teach, he dominated. If you came into his class unprepared, he'd make an example of you, not in a cruel way, but in a way that made sure you'd never forget who was in charge. Today, however, something was different. At first, he barely noticed the man sitting quietly in the back row, dressed in a plain black t-shirt and jeans. He blended in with the students. No fanfare, no entourage, just another face in the crowd. But when Wallace's eyes flickered over him, something clicked. His posture stiffened, his gaze narrowed. He knew that face. Everyone knew that face. Elon Musk. For a moment, Wallace thought he might be imagining things. What was Elon Musk doing in his classroom? There was no announcement, no special introduction. Just a billionaire casually sitting in on an advanced calculus lecture as if it were a TED Talk. Wallace exhaled through his nose, masking his surprise with a smirk. He wasn't about to let some tech mogul derail his class. If anything, this was an opportunity. He turned to the board, chalk in hand, and began scrawling an equation across it. The familiar rhythm of writing settled him, but his mind was already working, planning. A thought crept in, uninvited. This could be interesting. He knew Musk had an engineering background. The man had built rockets, after all. But how much of that was real knowledge, and how much was just hiring the right people? Billionaires love to act like they're the smartest person in the room. Wallace had seen it 100 times. If Musk wanted to sit in on his class, fine, but he wasn't getting a free pass. Wallace capped the chalk and turned back to the room, his smirk widening. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly. "It's not every day we get a celebrity guest." A few students turned to follow his gaze. A ripple of whispers spread through the hall. Some students sat up straighter, nudging their friends. Others pulled out their phones, recording before they even knew what was happening. Musk didn't react immediately. He just blinked, looking mildly amused. Wallace took a few slow steps toward the front of the classroom, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me," he continued, eyes still locked on Musk. "Are you just here to observe, or would you like to contribute?" A chuckle spread through the class. Wallace could feel the energy shifting. Anticipation. They'd seen him shut down cocky students before, but Musk wasn't a student. That made this even better. Musk finally spoke, his voice even, almost casual. "I just came to listen," he said, tilting his head. "Didn't expect a personal invitation." Wallace let out a low chuckle. "Oh, but we'd be foolish to waste such an opportunity. Since you're here, why don't we see just how sharp you really are?" More murmurs. A few students looked between Musk and the professor, waiting. Wallace turned back to the board and, with deliberate movements, started writing. This wasn't basic calculus. This was a monster of a problem, an intricate, multi-step equation that required a deep understanding of differential equations and tensor calculus, the kind of thing that would send even his top students into a panic. He stepped aside and tapped the board with the chalk. "Care to give it a shot?" The room was silent. Then, slowly, Musk stood, but something in his expression was off. Not nervous, not uncertain, just relaxed. Elon Musk stood up, stretching slightly as if he'd just been woken from a nap. His face showed no sign of stress, just quiet amusement. The room was silent, but not the usual kind. This wasn't boredom or routine. This was the kind of silence that came when people knew something was about to happen. Professor Wallace leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, watching like a man who had already won. "Take your time," he said, motioning toward the board. It's not exactly a tweet, but I'm sure you can manage. A few chuckles rippled through the class. Some students were already whispering, pulling out their phones, nudging their friends. This wasn't just a math problem anymore. It was a showdown. Musk stepped forward. He picked up the chalk, turning it over between his fingers. Then, without hesitation, he started writing. At first, it seemed normal enough. He was working through the problem the way any math student would. But something was off. It took Wallace 5 seconds to notice it. Musk wasn't just solving the equation. He was cutting through it. He wasn't following the long, meticulous process that Wallace had expected. Instead, he was skipping steps, leaping ahead, seeing patterns, making connections that only someone deeply fluent in mathematics could. Wallace's smirk flickered. The students started noticing too. Heads tilted, eyebrows raised, phones started recording. One student whispered, "Wait, is he simplifying it?" Because that's exactly what Musk was doing. He wasn't grinding through the grueling process Wallace had intended. He was tearing it apart, trimming the fat, cutting straight to the solution with a level of clarity that was almost infuriating. Wallace pushed off his desk, stepping closer. Musk kept writing, unfazed. No hesitation, no second guessing. And then, just like that, he was done. He put the chalk down, dusted off his hands, and turned around. "That should do it," he said, his tone casual, almost bored. Wallace's jaw clenched. He didn't look at the board right away. Instead, he stared at Musk, as if expecting him to burst out laughing, to admit it was a joke. But Musk just stood there. Finally, Wallace turned to face the board, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Musk hadn't just solved the problem. He had rewritten the entire approach. The solution wasn't just correct. It was elegant. It stripped away unnecessary steps, exposed the problem's core structure, and laid it bare. Wallace felt a slow heat creeping up his neck. No, this wasn't happening. A murmur spread through the class. Someone let out a low whistle. Another student whispered, "No way." Wallace forced a chuckle. "Well," he said, his voice just a little too loud, "I suppose that's one way to do it." Musk didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just shrugged. "Yeah, it's a little faster that way." A few students laughed, not at Musk, but at Wallace. The shift in energy was almost palpable. Wallace turned back to the board, searching for something, anything, to poke at. He scanned Musk's solution, looking for errors, for shortcuts that didn't hold up. But there weren't any. Musk had outmaneuvered him. Wallace set down the chalk, forcing his expression into something neutral. "All right," he said, nodding slowly. "Not bad." He turned back to the class. But mathematics isn't just about getting the right answer. It's about rigor, about proving that your method is universally applicable. Musk raised an eyebrow. "You're saying it needs to be more complicated?" Some students snickered. A few were openly grinning now. Wallace's stomach twisted. He had been so sure, that he'd walk Musk into a trap, that he'd prove the billionaire wasn't as smart as he claimed. But now the trap had flipped. But he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Professor Wallace's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. The smirks, the chuckles, the hushed whispers. He could feel the class turning. This was supposed to be a lesson in humility for Musk, not for him. But Wallace wasn't the type to back down. He cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "All right, Mr. Musk, that was impressive." He gestured toward the board. "But let's see if you can handle something a little more sophisticated." There it was, the classic move. When someone upstaged him, he raised the bar. He'd done it to students before, and it worked. Always. He grabbed the chalk and, with quick, sharp strokes, crafted a second problem. This one was different. Messier. It wasn't just a calculus equation. It was a multivariable nonlinear system, the kind that required not just precision, but an intuitive grasp of higher-order mathematics. This wasn't a test anymore. It was a trap. Wallace stepped back, dusting his hands, his smirk returning. "Your move." Musk glanced at the problem. Not a single muscle in his face moved. He picked up the chalk, and then he didn't write. He just stood there, eyes scanning the equation, silent. The tension in the room shifted. Students leaned in. Wallace could feel the anticipation, the silent electric moment before impact. Then, in one smooth motion, Musk erased half of the equation. The air in the room cracked open. Wallace's body stiffened. "What are you—" Musk twirled the chalk between his fingers, eyes still on the board. "This part here," he said, tapping a section Wallace had painstakingly written. "It's redundant." Wallace blinked. "Excuse me?" Musk gave a small shrug like it was obvious. "You built the problem to look complicated, but you used an unnecessary constraint. This section cancels itself out, so we don't need it." He turned back to the board and, with 5 swift strokes, rewrote the equation in its simplest form, a cleaner, more elegant version, then solved it in under 30 seconds. Silence. Wallace's heart pounded. He could feel it happening, the slow, crushing realization that he had just been outplayed. The students, they knew it too. One of them muttered, "Holy!" before trailing off. Another was straight up giggling. Musk turned back around, setting the chalk down gently. "That should do it." Wallace's lips parted, but no words came out. He stared at the board, the brutal simplicity of it. Musk hadn't just solved his problem, he had exposed it, stripped away the excess, cut straight to the truth. It was perfect, and Wallace hated it. A slow ripple moved through the room. Phones recorded, heads shook, eyes widened. A student leaned toward his friend and whispered, "Bro, he just cooked him." Wallace felt something ugly rising in his chest, a mix of frustration, embarrassment, maybe even a little fear. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Musk looked at him now, expectant, not gloating, not smug, just waiting. Wallace swallowed. His mouth felt dry. He needed to regain control. With forced composure, he squared his shoulders. "Well," he said, his voice just a little too stiff, "there's more than one way to approach a problem." Musk's lips twitched. "Sure," he said, "but the simplest way is usually the best." But Wallace wasn't about to let this end here. Professor Wallace could feel it now. The slow, creeping loss of control. The murmurs, the laughter, the students leaning in like they were watching a live debate. It wasn't just about the math anymore. It was about authority. And right now, he was losing it. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders back, trying to appear relaxed. "All right, Mr. Musk," he said, offering a tight smile. "You've got some tricks up your sleeve. I'll give you that." Musk gave a polite nod but didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Wallace turned back to the board, mind racing. He needed to put Musk in a position where he couldn't just shortcut his way through. "Mathematics," he continued, "isn't just about getting an answer. It's about understanding the journey. Let's see if you can handle something a little more fundamental." He stepped to the far side of the board and wrote one final challenge, not an equation, a proof. Wallace underlined it with a flourish and stepped back. This wasn't something you could solve with raw intuition. It required deep, structured reasoning, step by step. The moment the chalk hit the tray, the classroom buzzed. One of the top students, Jordan, a math major, whispered to his friend, "Oh, that's dirty." His friend frowned. "What do you mean?" Jordan leaned closer. "That's not a normal problem. That's a trap." The proof Wallace had written was deliberately misleading. It contained an intentional flaw, one so subtle that most students wouldn't catch it right away. It was designed to waste time. It was a way to make Musk fumble. Wallace turned back to Musk, who was still staring at the board, and then he smiled. Wallace's stomach dropped. Musk picked up the chalk and, without a second of hesitation, circled a section of the proof. "This part," he said, tapping it, "is wrong." Wallace froze. Musk turned toward the class, addressing them, not the professor. "This is a common mistake in proof writing," he said, his voice even. "It assumes something that hasn't been established yet." He turned back to Wallace. "Did you do that on purpose?" The class erupted. Some students gasped, others straight up laughed. Wallace's lips parted, but his brain was stuck. He had spent years controlling this room, setting the tone, dictating how knowledge was received. Now, for the first time, he wasn't the one leading the discussion. A student in the back muttered, "Dude, just reverse Uno'd him." Musk wasn't mocking him. That's what made it worse. Wallace had prepared a trap. Musk had walked right over it. And now, the class wasn't even looking at Wallace anymore. They were looking at Musk. A student raised their hand. "Wait, can you explain why that part is wrong?" Musk nodded, turning back to the board. "Sure." And just like that, he took over the lecture. He broke it down in simple, clear terms. No arrogance, no condescension, just pure understanding. The class was hooked. Wallace stood frozen, watching his own students learn from someone else. One by one, they started to nod. "Oh," one said, "that makes so much sense." Another turned to their friend. "Why didn't Wallace ever explain it like that?" And that was the final blow. Wallace could handle being outsmarted. He could handle being proven wrong. But watching his students realize that they had just learned more in 5 minutes from Elon Musk than they had in weeks from him, that was something else entirely. But there was no way Wallace was going to admit defeat. Not yet.